Well, to pick up, we're going to do double act, clearly. I hadn't realized, but let's do it. To pick up precisely on what Daniel has been saying there, there is very famous, the French pioneered in this area. It's very important to recognize the extraordinary superior quality of French 18th and 19th century scholarship. It translates itself under Napoleon into the École des Chartes, which is the first body, apart from the Bollandis, apart from the tradition within the Catholic Church, it's the first body to embark on the serious publication of historical documents according to modern standards of accuracy of transcription and whatever. And it trains up an entire archival tradition in France, which we are rather late in catching up on, though in fact we now do much better, of course. But this quaint rivalry on either side of the channel, which I call the widest strip of water in the world, because values, not simply values change as you go across it, they actually invert. But let's pick up on the precise point. You talked about the art of dates. The original technical work on this, which is French, is indeed called l'art de vérifier, I can't get my tongue around it, this hour in the morning, les dates. And it is the art of verifying dates. And you will remember that the turning point of my lecture yesterday was essentially that the Reformation happens on a day. It happens in a place, at a moment, between two people. It happens on the day of 1st of January, 1527. It happens in a place, Hever Castle in Kent, and between two people, one of whom is there, and the other of whom is I think, at Greenwich at the time. The king is at Greenwich, Anne Boleyn is at Hever, and she has received, or rather she sent on New Year's Day, she sent Henry from Hever, she sent him a New Year's Day gift. And the way I was able to date that letter is by, in fact, none of the methods you were talking about. It has no date on it. One of the things that's most extraordinary about private correspondence at this period, it usually has no date. It may have a saint's day. It'll be very unlikely to have a year. In other words, the art of doing it is by the art of reference, by the art of picking up odd detail. And the detail which enables you to date this absolutely crucial letter. This is the letter which Henry responds to that New Year's Day gift by the phrase aut illic aut nullibi, either there or nowhere, i.e. matrimony. Sworn on the oath of a king in a letter written in his very best polished French to Anne Boleyn, in his most sort of best hand, very much schoolboy, best handwriting, covering a very large, in fact, I think 2.5 pages, which for Henry is, to write that much and to write in person. Remember, most people at this point write by dictation. Dictation is the essential way in which things are composed. It's again one of the natures of rhetoric. If you read Cicero, you've got to remember it's written by dictation. You do not write yourself. You can, of course. But essentially, you write by dictation, and it is extraordinary to see people who can do it and people who can't. In other words, it's very closely related to the art of extempore speech, right? Or indeed to the musical forms of this period, which involve an enormous amount. You simply have effectively a single note line, and you have to be able to ornament it, and it's taken for granted that you can do that. So just about going back to that letter, so Henry, Anne Boleyn sends Henry some kind of, probably a hat badge or brooch, which shows a maiden in a ship in a storm-tossed sea. And of course what this suggests is the maiden, and she then writes a note, I imagine in French verse, because this correspondence is entirely in French, she writes probably a verse in French which sort of says, I have been in the storm-tossed sea, my heart has been troubled, I now find my refuge in you. Right, you've offered me safe, in other words, I've come back to safe harbour. And the king then responds to this with that word étrenne, Strena, New Year's Day gift, and there's only one new year it can possibly be, which is the 1st of January 1527. With that, we have now anchored the entire process of the Reformation, and it will surprise nobody who knows anything about Henry that it is only once he's secured Anne that he begins divorce proceedings against Catherine. Henry is a drunk when it comes to women. Have you watched a drunk at the bar? He will always, some of you may reflect on our own consciences, they line up one drink before the glass is empty. You always have a full glass before you drain the current one. Henry is a bit like that with wives. So again, the reason these letters survive, the reason I'm able to enter into Henry's mind in this extraordinary way, you're asking how we know this. The reason that I'm able to do this, why do these extraordinary letters survive? From a relationship that Henry came to abominate. They survive because they're stolen from Anne. They're stolen almost certainly, I would reckon, by the Marchioness of Exeter, who's her principal lady-in-waiting and is profoundly hostile to the process of what were going on, and they're spirited away to Rome. I reckon they're now in the Vatican Library. They're amongst the greatest treasures of the Vatican Library. So when the Vatican Library was looted by Napoleon, when he conquers Italy, one of the greatest treasures are the Henry VIII love letters, which are removed to Paris. And interestingly enough, that's when they become really well known. When they emerge from the seal of quasi-secrecy of the Vatican, they're engraved properly for the first time, and they're studied properly for the first time. They were available in England through a transcription that should have been published in Thomas Hearne's royal letters, but he regarded them as being too obscene to do so, because I'm afraid Henry VIII had a thing about Anne's breasts, about which he writes quite imaginatively at some points, and this was regarded as being altogether too much. But there we are. So you know about it because these letters were regarded at the time as key legal evidence. Henry is claiming that his divorce is an act done in good faith. That is to say, that he would have wished his marriage to Catherine to be proved valid. It is perfectly clear he is lying from the very beginning, I'm afraid. So equally, of course, he thinks he's like Tony Blair. All good liars believe their own lies. It's extremely important. I mean, I needn't tell you this. You're all much more familiar with men's souls than I am. But they really do. So these letters go to the Vatican because they provide the evidence for Henry's bad faith. And I'm sure this is why when Reginald Pole comes to write against the divorce in the latter part of the 1530s, he actually has these letters in front of him. I'm convinced this is why he is able to cut utter. Why, of course, he's unforgiven by his royal cousin, not only for his act of betrayal, but this extraordinary penetration into what Henry was doing is on the basis of documentation. And these documents then are kept in the Vatican, and of course provide the basis for what I'm sure you're aware. I am in one sense giving a fully Catholic interpretation of the Reformation. That it is simply a product of the English Reformation, that it's simply a product of lust. Love, lust, whatever you want to call it. In other words, Henry falling out of love. Henry's a romantic. He believes in romantic love. We know this. He actually says he marries Catherine of Aragon. His great love song, Pastime with Good Company, I loved where I did marry, rhyming with Harry. I loved where I did marry, and there's every reason to believe him. It's quite clear that he, as a result of the documents I was talking about last night, the documents of 1504, the extraordinary collection of special bulls and privileges and indults and everything else that you got from Rome, as a result of those, Henry's sense of, forgive me, the too many limoncello spritz, too many limoncello spritzers last night there. Anyway, let's. I'm now going much too much into the detail on this point, and I apologise. But you diverted me, but a useful diversion. But have we all got the picture then? There is the history that I'm doing is a history which tries to take you into the absolute specifics of human behaviour, and it does it by person, by place, by moment. Now, the reason, again, for going back to that date in 1527 is that I've given you the picture of Henry as an absolutely conventional, good Catholic boy to that point. And I think we really do need to take that seriously. I'll now, because we're going to shift onto grounds of ceremony and we're going to shift onto grounds of music, I want to repeat and just emphasize that. I also want to do something else at the point that we were making when we were talking before the talk, we should really call it, before the talk began. I was saying the last approach that you can take to the English Reformation is the approach that is always taken. That is confessional. It is not confessional. The question, is Henry a Catholic or a Protestant after 1527, is meaningless. It really is completely meaningless. The other point to be made, that we have to establish the absolute centrality of the royal supremacy. What the English Reformation is about is the most extreme act of Erastianism in the history of the Church. We all know what I mean, of course, by Erastianism. That's to say, the dominance by the secular power of the Church. That is what it is. The extent to which the Church of England acquires confessional coherence, that's a matter for you. But what I can explain is why it doesn't, and why it takes so long to do so. Right. Now, let's actually then go back to, in parallel with the Henry that I've shown as the papalist Henry so closely involved with Rome, let's go back now and look at another thing. Again, historians in particular, as amateur theologians, always tend to approach the Reformation from the point of view of confession from belief. In most ways, this is not how contemporaries seem to have thought about religion. They think about religion in many ways, I think, as you do, as ceremony, as what you see. Of course, there's a profound meaning behind what you see, what you do, what you wear. For example, if we just leap forward, because we're also talking about Elizabeth, if we leap forward to the beginning of Elizabeth's reign, is anybody here familiar with the diary of Henry Machin? Right. If you want to know what happens under Elizabeth, you look at the diary of Henry Machin. Henry Machin is, again, somebody we were chatting about heraldry. Henry Machin is on the margins of the College of Heralds. He seems to be some sort of funeral director, but he's very, very interested in these sort of details. And when Elizabeth's first bishops, these people who've come, some from Geneva, some from Strasbourg, have experienced full reformations of one sort or another, when they come back to London, how does she actually deal with them? By a very simple thing. She insists that they exchange their Geneva gowns for rochet and shamir. What does Machin notice? Just the fact that they're wearing what bishops always have worn. So it's these externals, which are very easy to call just externals, but that is how you largely register what is going on, by what it looks like, and of course by what it sounds like. And I think that we really do need to comprehend this. So what I want then to do, I want now quickly to summarize the nature of the religious observance up to 1527, and then look at how change happens and why in many ways it doesn't happen. Okay? Once again, it's very important to start at the right point. This is why I insist again on specificity. Very important to start at the right point. There's been an enormous amount of recent work done on Henry, and I hope most of you will be as puzzled by it as I am, which claims that he doesn't change at all. But he was somehow always this thing called an Erasmian. Now, let's get this absolutely straight. Henry, one of the great peculiarities of Henry, he is the first king since Henry II to be fully Latinate, formally Latinate. Many kings could read some Latin, Henry can write it. There's an extraordinary change in Henry's education from the moment that he goes to his father's court, from immediately after his brother Arthur's death, even before he goes to his father's court. You get his earlier tutor, Skelton, is replaced by another man called John Holt, who is and Skelton, of course, that extraordinary helter-skelter poet and whatever, is an excellent Latinist, but in the late medieval florid style. Holt is the first pioneer teacher in England of the new Erasmian, Neo-Ciceronian Latin. And Henry is plunged straight into that. His Socius Studiorum, the man who manages his education, is Lord Mountjoy, who again is one of the very few lay peers to have received formal higher education, which he completes abroad in Paris, directly under Erasmus. So he has direct experience. He also employs the man who becomes, again, the figure that I was using as evidence of so much of what's going on in 1513. He also uses Ammonio as his own secretary, who is then promoted to being Latin secretary to the king. So we've got then a king who is steeped in the new Latin and the new approaches that are associated with Erasmus. Does that then mean that he absorbs the critical apparatus of Erasmus? Does that then mean that, like Erasmus, and we all, I hope, know this, Erasmus, and indeed Thomas More at this point, are scathing about the church as it is? They mock pilgrimages. They mock pilgrimages as brutally as Christopher Hitchens. Erasmus, as we'll see in a moment, abominates church music, loathes it. The rituals of Walsingham. Many of you have been on pilgrimage to Walsingham. Erasmus laughs his head off publicly. In the Ad Ages, there's a long, long section. This absurd story on a house, descending from on high. How much did they pay the builders? How did the mortar? Just this scathing, brutal mockery. St. Thomas, another adage, on pilgrimage to Canterbury, drips with sarcasm. What about Henry? Henry is, and we have absolute direct evidence for it, Henry, as a young man, we've actually got his prayer roll. We've got the thing that was at Ushaw College. I was talking about Lingard, John Lingard, the great Catholic historian of the early 19th century. He's the real founder of Ushaw, which was intended to be north of Durham, on the bleak, windswept moorland. It was intended to be the Catholic Oxbridge, which is why the buildings are on the scale that they are. But of course, things changed. But the Ushaw roll, which was kept there, is the actual prayer roll that Henry used and presented to William Thomas, one of his favourite grooms of the chamber, and it's inscribed, "William, pray for me as I pray for you, Henry Princeps, Henry P." And that roll is the most traditional, with belief in the chanting of the name of God, of specific indulgences promised by popes, some of whom were real, some of whom won't, that if you put this roll on the belly of a woman in labour, the child will at least survive to be baptized, which is regarded as clearly quite a good thing, and all that sort of thing. The most, if you like, primitive forms of late medieval adoration are there. And that is Henry's. Henry goes on pilgrimage. He doesn't go on pilgrimage very much. In fact, he stops going on pilgrimage absolutely to Walsingham. Why? Because the Virgin let him down. He went to Walsingham after the birth of his first son, Prince Henry, to give thanks for the birth in 1511, to give thanks for the birth of this boy. And on his way back from pilgrimage, the boy had died. So the Virgin's off. It is, again, the heavenly host are treated in precisely the same way of the you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. And so instead Henry turns his attention to more reliable miracle workers. And he goes regularly on pilgrimage to somebody you've never heard of called Master John Shawn, who is not actually formally canonized, but is one of these figures who's a popular canonization. And he's a kind of dependency of good King Henry, that's Henry VI, who again is not formally canonized. But we need to remember in the late Middle Ages that he is the most popular saint in England, completely overtaking Thomas of Canterbury. Thomas of Canterbury, how long is he key pilgrimage from the 12th century. And yet, for 50 years of good King Henry, from his death in 1471, you get what? You get a third as many pilgrim badges for Henry VI surviving as for Becket over all those centuries. In other words, there's a complete... remember, there are fashions in saints. There are fashions in belief. There are fashions in practices. So Henry then is completely normal in terms of his religious practices, in terms of pilgrimage, in terms of the belief of miracles, of direct intervention, and so on. That's the person. But you've also got to embed Henry in fundamental cultural and court practices. The work of somebody whom I found myself quasi-supervising as well as very naughtily examining their dissertation, Fiona Kisby, opened my eyes, Danny's and virtually everybody else in the field, with her study of the Chapel Royal, which demonstrates, and this again is something we have to understand when we look at the role of the monarchy as supreme head and its relationship to the church. Royal ceremony before the House of Hanover, royal ceremony essentially up to 1713-14, royal ceremony is religious. The centre of the court in terms of ceremonial practice is not the throne room, is not the presence chamber, although of course you have the throne in the presence chamber to which you have to doff your hat and bow if you're a man and kneel and curtsy if you're a lady. The actual centre of court ceremony is the chapel, and it is the chapel year which defines the court year. So the court year is essentially the church year. And the great moments of the court year are the great feasts, in nearly all of which, the king has a special quasi-Christ role. Exemplified most fully with Epiphany, with the 6th of January, where, and you will still, some of you, have we all been to an Epiphany at St. James's? Anybody? Go, because it's the final relic of this. A gentleman usher will offer up gold, frankincense, and myrrh in ritual form, which the king did. And that tiny fragment survives. Other things that have been revived, like the Maundy in the 20th century. The Maundy was also, of course, the day in which, again, the reasons for this, of course, are manifold and complex, but it's also associated with something else that we're coming up to that will shift into... We'll shift into our talk this afternoon. The coronation. The king is anointed and consecrated in a much more elaborate ritual than any bishop, and with an anointing that is vastly more elaborate. It's on the shoulders, it's on the breasts, it's here, hence the armils, on the hands and on the head. And the anointing on both the head and the hands is regarded as so holy that it's not removed, and instead a coif is put on the king's head and linen gloves on his hands, and it's some days later in the full medieval rite, certainly before the anointing of the head, before the coif is removed. Unfortunately, with Henry IV, when the full elaboration of the eagle ampullum or the rest of it is invented to resacralize the monarchy after the desacralization of the dethroning and murder of Richard II, unfortunately develops a very bad attack of head lice, because clearly the oil of unction feeds these little creatures, and he must have had a most terrible itch and had to be shaved after this thing, which he does not desanctify him. But the point is that the sanctification of the royal hands means also on the Maundy, the king performs the modern service, except he does actually kneel down. Admittedly, the feet have been pre-washed twice. You get a yeoman doing the really dirty job. Then the royal Wolsey had to do this, and then the royal almoner does the final clean-up, and the king sort of dips them into scented water, with lots of towels being proffered. But at the same time, he performs the ceremony of blessing cramp rings. I'm sure we all know that the king is able to cure scrofula, the touching for the king's evil, but the English have an extra special miracle as well, in which the king, a bowl of gold rings and bang. It's exactly like people who wear copper rings or whatever, allegedly to deal with rheumatism or whatever. They had exactly the same belief, but the King of England soups it up because you have a special service in which there's an intonation, even as thou hast blessed these our hands, O Lord, with the oil of thine unction, so may we. Spittle, rub the ring, and then these things are sold or given away as highly profitable gifts to cure rheumatism and and falling sickness and all sorts of things. So this sacralization of the royal person, the relationship of intensely elaborate ritual, and of course the music, which is both there to lend splendor. Again, we need to understand that the notion of worship being invested with splendor. Those of you, some of us went to Castel Gandolfo, some of you will be going, many of you will be familiar with the riches of the Vatican collections, the splendor of embroidery, of fabric, of paint, of jewels, of gold, of altars loaded with candlesticks, with images, virtually crushing them to the ground, all part of the magnificence of worship and excuse me, a royal music, which is similarly elaborate. Right, that's Henry. What does Erasmus say? Well, we've heard Erasmus mocking pilgrimages. We've heard Erasmus mocking the belief in simple miracles and whatever. What does Erasmus say about music? I'm sure you're familiar with the key verse that is used to argue against the musical tradition, which is 1 Corinthians 14. And that, of course, is again, it's St. Paul dealing with the issue of speaking in tongues. And the key verse is, I thank God I speak with tongues more than ye all. St. Paul writes, yet in the church I had rather speak 5 words with my understanding, that by my voice I might teach others also, than 10,000 words in an unknown tongue. And that, of course, that's talking about speaking in tongues, the ululation and all the rest of it. The Reformation and the pre-Reformation and Erasmus and Luther and Cranmer use it in an entirely different way. They use it to attack the use of Latin on the one hand, and to replace it with the vernacular. And they also use it to attack the disguising of the word, of the clarity of the word, by rich music. And this is how Erasmus goes on. Remember, this is Erasmus at the court of Henry VIII. He's actually writing this in England, from his experience in England, and we all know, and Danny will tell us about it, that in England there is the peculiar glory of church music. And how does he deal with it? In some countries, he says, the whole day is now spent in endless singing, Yet one worthwhile sermon exciting true piety is hardly heard in 6 months, not to mention the kind of music that has been brought into divine worship in which not a single word can be understood, nor is there a free moment for the singers to contemplate what they are singing. And then he goes on, the attack gets more and more home to England. We all know, I'm sure, the stories of Henry VIII and Wolsey poaching the best boy tenors. I hope we know the fact that the Venetians marvel at the quality of Henry VIII's music. Henry also poaches one of the best Venetian organists, Dionysius Memo and whatever and so on. So this intense competition. What is Erasmus saying about this? We brought into the sacred edifices a certain elaborate and theatrical music. Straight trumpets, curved trumpets, pipes, and sambucas resound everywhere and vie with human voices. People flock to church as to a theatre for aural delights. And then it goes on further and further, and suddenly we're back in England, really home in England. These activities are so pleasing to monks, especially the English, that they perform nothing else. They think God is pleased with ornamental neighing and agile throats. In this custom also, in Benedictine colleges in Britain, young boys, adolescents, and professional singers are supported, who sing the morning service to the Virgin Mother with a very melodious interweaving of voices and organs. And then those who are more doltish still than really learned in music are not content on feast days unless they use a certain distorted kind of music called descant. You know, this neither gives forth the pre-existing melody nor observe the harmonies of the art. In addition, when temperate music, that's plain song, is used in church so that the meaning of the words may come more easily to the listener, it also seems a fine thing if some or one other part, intermingled with the rest, is ornamented and produces a tremendous tonal clamour so that not a single word is understood. That's Erasmus. Now you can see the absolute contradiction between that and Henry. How on earth does anything change? Because Henry, in 1527, what Henry persuades himself of in 1527 are really three straightforward things. The first is that his marriage to Catherine is against natural, divine, and moral law. He persuades himself of that. Secondly, that because it's against natural, divine, and moral law, the Pope has no power to dispense it. And thirdly, he persuades himself that in any case, the Pope has no power other than as Bishop of Rome, and that according to divine ordination, historical tradition, England is and always has been an empire in which the king always was and should be head of the church. He persuades himself of those three principles. Now, it seems to me those are the only things that Henry is absolutely committed to. Everything else is open to debate. And again, we need to understand this precisely. The obvious thing for England to have done, wouldn't it, would have been to have Lutheranized. But Henry hates Luther, and Luther hates Henry. So you cannot use the Lutheran confession as a basis for the English Reformation. But you have nothing else. The natural thing to have done would have been to have used the Augsburg Confession and to have entered into an alliance with the Schmalkaldic League. But you can't do that because of them. In other words, you've got not simply to see everything changing in 1527. You've got to see how minimally and little things actually change in 1527, and how the chap in charge is the person that I've been describing. Are you seeing what I mean, trying to get at all along? In other words, to persuade Henry to change involves tremendous effort, always on each specific issue. Henry knows that he's changed. This is why the people who argue that Henry is an Erasmian all along. Henry knows that he's changed, but the way change happens is by a specific argument on every issue. And this again is where you go back to Henry's essential Erasmianism, to Henry's Erasmian training, not his belief in the whole package of things that goes with it. Henry is profound, like all of the people of this period, he's a believer in debate. I know this sounds extraordinary. We think of him as, this absolute brutal king. We know that every single issue, religious issue, is deliberately debated between supporters of the old and supporters of the new. Every time you set up a religious commission, you will have exactly evenly balanced bishops on both sides. Every vexed issue that he's interested in, he will set up a discussion in his privy chamber. He will have gentlemen who are Catholic in inclination. He will have gentlemen who are radically reformed in inclination. And they will debate. It must have been the most terrifying exercise. But you are required to present the case. And the king will then simply decide. This is why there is this extraordinary absence of logic. No, I'm being really, really serious. Why the changes of faith in the latter part of Henry's reign have no logical sense whatever. They are the result of a bit like a papal decision. I mean, they are the result of one person choosing. And that person is the king. And I will hand over to Danny in a moment to come in on this. I'm afraid we've rather left Elizabeth out, but let me just conclude. It's very clear that as you move through the reign, the various pressures which are brought to bear on Henry by Cranmer, by Anne Boleyn, and so on, Henry is again developing method in the way I presented this as chaotic. In some ways it is. I did a series on Churchill. Churchill learning to be a great war prime minister as an author. Churchill learns how to run a government machine, and we saw the disaster of what happens when you're running a war cabinet and you can't do it with Boris Johnson and COVID, when we had effectively a war cabinet. Churchill learns how to manage it by writing his great three-volume biography of his ancestor, the Duke of Marlborough. It's there that he works out ideas of the fact that the pursuit of European hegemony is very often associated with the persecution of minorities, using Louis XIV as a kind of prototype for Hitler, so the persecution of the Huguenots and the French determination to conquer Europe at that point. Henry works all this out by writing books, by accumulating the material to write books. In other words, there is again no rupture. The processes that he underwent to write the Assertio Septem Sacramentorum, he then repeats at each stage of the Reformation process. So once Rome has refused his divorce in 1529, what is the first thing Henry does? He reforms the Royal Library. It's quite extraordinary. The Royal Library up to that point is very much like the modern Royal Library. I'm sure many of you have dined at Windsor, and you will be entertained with beautiful books, exquisitely bound, that have never been opened. Save it a picture. And the original Royal Library was very like that. Do we all not realize an illuminated manuscript is a bit like the Sunday Times colour supplement, you know? But that's what it's there. And Henry transforms the Royal Library in 1529 into an actual working library. A working library of theology, history, and all the rest of it, in which the books are arranged it's extraordinary, alphabetically. They're given Arabic catalogue numbers. They're marked up in the margin. And you have effectively a card index system on, divorce, moral, divorce, natural, divorce, whatever, Judaism and divorce, the Emperor Constantine and the papacy. You've got all of these things. He then uses as quarries immensely. What he does, and we can see it particularly from his Psalter at the end of his reign, he marks up, he reads the manuscripts, and he marks them in different coloured inks with notes in the margin. And then a clerk transcribes the sections of notes, noting where they come from and what they're supposed to be used for. And the thing is then put together, called the Collectanea Satis Copiosa, a sufficiently complete collection, and that's the quarry for all the arguments on the divorce, all the arguments on the royal supremacy, and so on. And at each stage, Henry is doing that. And towards the end, it's focusing very, very much onto the question of music. And pilgrimages have gone, images are under attack, and so on. And how does Henry deal with it? He goes through the Psalter, deliberately having Cranmer in his ear saying, Erasmus says this, 1 Corinthians 14 says this, and what Henry says, well, actually, look at the book of Psalms. Look at Psalm 81, where you have the make a joyful noise unto the God of Jacob. And if you look at his Psalter, you'll actually see the illustration. Bring hither the tabret, the merry harp, and the lute. Blow up the trumpet in the new moon, even in the time appointed. Now, have all the court musicians doing that, and then he goes, and there's an NB in the margin, and then when he goes on to Psalm 49:4, I will open my dark saying upon the harp. He writes in the margin, of course in Latin, NB with praise upon the psaltery, and then in Psalm 66:1 and 2, make a joyful noise unto the Lord, all ye lands. Sing forth the honour of his name, make his praise glorious. He notes again, of the praises to be given to God, why by Psalm 98, 5 and 6, praise the Lord upon the harp, sing with the harp with psalm of thanksgiving, with trumpet also, and with psalms, O show yourself joyful below the Lord. He writes simply of worship. What is worship? And you can see what Henry is doing. He's using this to silence Cranmer. And he has all of these entries copied up into a printed text. This is on a manuscript text. And on the basis of that, he dies before it's done. I'm absolutely sure he was going to compound a new personally written text, which would have been a sort of formulary of faith of Davidic monarchy, of Old Testament monarchy, built on the foundations of the royal supremacy in England. So we've got to weave the ceremony, the personality, the routine, the rituals, the music. And you've got a moment to lead us back into the music.
An amazing idea, but David referenced right at the beginning Hever Castle. Hever is an exact example of what David's talking about, time and place. Those who've been, you've noticed how small it is. There's a reason for that. Firstly, smaller houses mean less people, so it's great for play. So the royal children, David demonstrate, were often sent to these much smaller houses around the country, so they were safe for play. Hever Castle is not for that. Hever Castle is simply prying eyes, all the rest of you cannot be in the main house. So he and Anne can do whatever they please. We'll leave it there. But it's important to recognise...
We use more vulgar terms.
But I just want to pick up on Henry as a composer. Henry is very much in this mould, as you've heard, of believing literally in that formulary of worship with the instruments. So much so that Henry, as a monarch, amasses the largest collection of musical instruments pretty much at any moment, and it's so impressive. David mentioned the New Year's Day gifts. The New Year's Day gift giving to Henry was an amazing procession. People gave things like they knew one of the best gifts to Henry were greyhounds and particular types of hunting dogs. So if you imagine the room, and it was piled high with the most phenomenal gifts. And the lists that exist from this, I'm sure you have to make sure you go and look at the list before and make sure you're active, so bring the country without doing so. But Henry's composer is doing something really interesting. He's educated by his mother initially, because he's not going to be king, and his mother has a love affair with a particular style of older English church music, and they alluded to this. We have this thing called the Contenance Anglaise, the sweet-sounding English music. There is a particular compositional device, a sweet third. Henry loves this, so much so that the investigation recently of Henry's own compositions definitively proves that some of the much later music, which has always been dated as really early because it's early in style, is Henry rebuffing people and saying, firstly, he's establishing the dynastic idea of the Tudors because he's copying these favourite court composers of his father. He's an undoubted, very fine composer. He's not the best, but if you go and listen to some of his music, it's incredibly elaborate. He writes in a very old, glorious style. We've done some of his music, and it's very fine. There's no doubt that Pastime Movement Company, which is copied into various different languages, is a real pop hit. It becomes things that's quoted in sermons, it becomes things that are... It becomes an anthem, in the popular style. It's brilliant. It's also Henry sees music as part of that growing idea. It has its roots in the medieval scholasticism of reflecting the music of the spheres, reflecting the Pythagorean ideas about beauty and truth notion. But it's becoming also a means to being virtuous. He takes very literally that psalm imperative for those instruments, and he actually, some of his scholars get it a bit wrong, so they decide the psaltery is that it actually is a specific instrument they know about. But he revives ideas about these different, you heard him talk about the long trumpets, curved trumpets. They are the original Hebrew instruments, the shawls, the rebec, all these other things that they believe were the He's asking these people who are becoming scholars of Hebrew to try and really make sure they've got the right instruments. If you look at the later piece, William Byrd, and then even further forward, Bratton, writing Hosting Joyfully, the style of vocal writing is mimicking the instruments. So it completely stops being polyphonic when you get the low trumpet design. And they just go bum, 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 and they do that, they're all the voices together. And then when the lute happens, you can almost hear the lute style of playing, you have to strum to go to chords, so that the voices come in slightly delayed after each other. Henry, of course, regards it as being gentlemanly to learn the lute. I don't know if you've ever seen lute tablature. Do you know how many music was written out? It's incredibly difficult to do. Henry is incredibly beautiful, there's no doubt about it. We know, of course, he didn't write green sleeves. We know that he did write a mass. We know that he did write an orchestra of very fine music. And it's very, very clear that Henry believed that worship and music went together so much, it was integral to it. So much so that priests would confidently say, Henry didn't hear a set mass was sung because of that biblical imperative for the use of the voice. And it's an argument that continues to this day. The Orthodox Church cannot have instrumental music. Why? That's the hangover of the fact that people believe that the voice was the only instrument designed by the deity. Music also, or vocal music, has the glory of being text. But text, in the people and in Henry's mind, isn't that oral section of every syllable. We're not yet at one syllable, one note. It's the idea that music is giving you virtuousness through the fact it's moving your spirit, elevating you. And I think anybody who goes to the opera or anything, you're not sitting there expecting to understand every word, but you do have an absolute communication, which is vital. It's of the essence. So,
can we just pause there? Because you see, I think, again, that point really does need picking up. There's an absolute radical divide. Go back, isn't it fascinating how across centuries we're using the same language? Erasmus says again, theatrical performance. And he sees it as an abomination. Because remember, the key to understanding the 16th century, it's the age of print. The book is the most fashionable object you can think of. The profession of a proofreader is a noble one. Erasmus actually proofreads the editions of the classics, the Froben and all the rest of it, editions of the classics in both Basel and in Venice. And the word assumes this mystical point. You all know that the word, the logos, does not actually mean the text of the Bible. They think it does. The word of God, the verbum Dei, becomes the actual text of the Bible. In other words, the whole sola scriptura is a kind of heresy in its understanding. And Erasmus is a pioneer of that heresy. Erasmus is wholly verbal. And you could say I think very simply, that the Reformation is essentially the replacement of a visual and oral culture with a written culture. This is what it centrally is. And Henry, of course, sits in the absolute middle of this process as a uniquely literate king with a uniquely good library, with one that's uniquely well organized, a king who has spectacles everywhere. He becomes very short-sighted because he reads so much. There are writing desks everywhere. He travels it's so modern, he travels with book boxes. You know exactly what was on his bedside table when he died. Supremely literate king, piles of paper, notebooks, and whatever. And yet at the same time, there's enough of that old Henry that every process of the demolition of that oral and visual world is fought over to the detail. And it's also a king who does his own research. I think we need to take a much more active view of Henry. I mean, in one sense, it is right. I mean, if I was, some of you were very sweetly saying how nice it was. I was saying some of my early work was wrong. A great deal of it is absolutely right. Let me now boast. If you look at my personality and politics, which it's about 100 pages long. It's been more chewed over than almost any other 100 pages of work on that period. But the structure that it gives you there of factional dispute around the king, of different groups of people, different pressures brought to bear upon the king. Remember, this is, if you like, this is court religion. That it's religion determined by struggles within a tiny little inner group in the royal palace and the royal chapel. But with Henry at the heart of it. And Henry, whenever he's given something, is critical, is intelligent, reads, notes, documents, challenges, and finally accepts or doesn't. And interestingly, whilst it's being debated, you can say pretty much whatever you want. I mean, something like Tunstall dares to remind Henry in 1532 that he had once fought as a crusader for the Pope. He reminds him in detail, because of course Tunstall was involved, he reminds him in detail of what I was talking about yesterday, his campaign as a papal crusader in the War of 1513, the fact that he'd written in defence of the Pope in 1521 and so on. And Henry responds acerbically, of course, but saying, I was a young man and I was led astray by people like you. In other words, Henry, in that sense, accepts Erasmus's account of his behaviour in Julius Exclusus. But it's this business of the word, it's this business of the textual formation. But equally, of course, without any form of reference. I mean, again, when Cromwell, one of the centerpieces of Cromwell's policy, indeed of Cranmer, is to try to push Henry into alignment with the Lutherans, with the Schmalkaldic League. What does Henry do? He makes Tunstall the man who was at the Diet of Worms, who first alerts him to the dangers of Luther. He hands all the documents that Cromwell and Cranmer have prepared to Tunstall. And Tunstall says, well, sir, you do remember, don't you, when we worked together on this kind of thing? And you veto. The entire, which again is the background to the collapse of the Cleves marriage and everything else. But this extraordinary grasp of detail going across time, and but the total in that sense, irrationality. That once you've rejected that possibility of alignment with Augsburg, everything is simply arbitrary. Every single change is piecemeal. There is no central logic other than what the king decided to do.
I think some of you here may be familiar with that amazing book by Lawrence Hemming on worship as revelation. I use that just as an example of the scholarship that's taking place on the notion of presence. In this period, presence becomes very important because of the fact that music announces the time of day, but more particularly when the king goes forth on a procession indoors.
To and from chapel. By the way, the only time that the king is visible publicly is on his way to and from chapel. That this again is something we've really just got to get into our heads. That normally the king is invisible. He is in the privy chamber where he's surrounded by this tiny inner group. Again, having access to that private area of the palace, the privy chambers, is also the privy council. It's why it's called the privy. Nudge, nudge. That's why it's called the Privy Council. And the king only. You've used the phrase. The king's coming forth means he steps through the doors of the privy chamber. The double doors swing open, the ushers and the two royal guards, the important royal guard at this point, the gentlemen pensioners, are standing in the presence chamber as the king comes from the privy chamber. The trumpets sound, and he walks through the galleries. You can see this completely clearly at Hampton Court. You can see the king's actual route, because, of course, everything is on the first floor, and the king is in the Chapel Royal. He has the special royal first floor pew, which still exists at Hampton Court, and he sits in the dress circle. And when you come to Elizabeth's reign, you can see why the clergy are crushed. They're down there, she is up there. And it's glazed and there are windows, and if the king or queen does not like the sermon, the windows open and your career is over. It really, but it's this placiness. Yep. It's this placiness through music.
There's a wonderful idea. Those of us who come from the north know that you go to your grandmother's house, you stand in the hallway, and she'll say, "Oh, come indoors." And if you think about it logically, you're already indoors. There's a notion of this in music. The instruments that declare the king is, even though it's indoors, is going to be in a more public and a large space, are the brassy outdoor instruments.
The wind, it's wind. So it's
your cornets and sackbuts. Those people, they're not the ones who have the real intimate access to the king. So there is a hierarchy of musicians.
Their chamber, again, it's why chamber music is called chamber music. And the key musicians, the remark about Henry's wonderful collection of musical instruments, we know about this because Henry dies leaving a minor behind, minor behind. That means all his possessions are inventoried. And I edited the Harleian and the Society of the double manuscript, which is split between the Society of Antiquaries and the British Museum in the Harleian collection. And the man in charge of it is Philip van der Wilder. These people are usually French-speaking. They're Wallon. They are from the French-speaking Netherlands. Henry is brought up by one. Henry has two teachers of music, one of which is chamber music, and the other is wind music. And there's a complete understood difference between the two. And by the way, I've been able to date when virtually all Henry's musical compositions take place. It's the summer of 1510. And the reason for this is Henry spent the summer of 1509 working hard, trying to engineer war with France behind the back of his council using the Venetian ambassador. He is heavily slapped down when the council reassembles on All Saints' Day. Right? That's the beginning of the new political year, and he sulks then and refuses to have anything to do with government right through the summer of 1510, when he then discovers, of course, that Julius II is busily plotting war, and the king and the pope negotiate with each other, to the horror of the French ambassador, Dariusol, who tries to stop this process by negotiations with a treacherous apostolic nuncio in England, one of the Bonvisi family of Lucca. So his compositions are, in one sense, this is when he writes Pastime with Good Company, they are a reaction to his being forced out of the council saying, God, sir, this was stupid behaviour, please, let us know what's going on. And because he said, remember, he's only 18. They're able to do this, and you see him eventually establishing that coalition of bishops and the Papal Alliance and war. But now I think it's very sad that we haven't really mentioned Elizabeth, and we should very, 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 very quickly. Everything that Dan has been talking about should have vanished. If Edward had lasted, nothing would have survived. As you know, the entire, apart from continental manuscripts, our entire knowledge of medieval music is down essentially to two manuscripts, two collections, the Eton Choir Book and the Old Hall Choir Book. And if they had not survived, everything would have gone. The only thing you could have done was to reconstruct it from the scraps that were incorporated in book bindings, because this is what happens to these things. Similarly, the destruction of the apparatus of worship would have been absolute. But Edward dies early. You get the piecing together of what's left, much of it kept in great danger under Mary. And then this extraordinary behaviour of Elizabeth, with the Chapel Royal being a resort of profound conservatism. And the other thing that's been very recently discovered, again very much associated with the coronation and what's going to go on now, despite the fact that he's appointed by William Cecil, who is constantly trying to push Elizabeth into a direction of full Reformation, trying to get rid of the candlesticks, trying to get rid of, so we even have a crucifix, trying to get rid of all those things. He appoints one of his dependents, a man called Goodman, as Dean of Westminster. And Goodman is fascinating. This is extraordinary. He begins the process of Westminster as a treasury of the royal past. Again, you would have expected, with the pressures within the Elizabethan Church, that there would have been a clearing out of the royal regalia. Remember, how on earth does a coronation with anointing survive in a Protestant state? That invocation of saints. So it is this extraordinary series of accidents of Elizabeth's personal taste in music, of her fondness for ceremony, her understanding that you cannot have a Calvinist monarchy. You look at the problem with having one in Scotland. That you need the monarchy and ceremony, therefore church, are in this extraordinary, in other words, James, in that sense, no bishop, no king, being absolutely right. And then these personal accidents of individuals taking over important sites, and the collection that Goodman goes out of his way to acquire, to retain every scrap of fabric. The retention, and of course it's all destroyed in the 17th century, with the Puritan Reformation, but not before it had all been catalogued, and not, of course, before the practices had re-entered the church with Laudianism. I think we should...
We'll take a break. Thank you both. Absolute marvellous. We've got 15 minutes, everyone, to think of your refinement questions and think of the subject. I have a question already.
That's a relief. Yes.
Yeah. So if we can be back here at 25 to plus 15, we can be back here at 10 to 11. And I'm sure you can bring a coffee with you if you want to, but if we can be back here at 10 to
11. A pupil of mine now, and he just sort of does this. And it's fantastic. It's a
with an Etonian's utter arrogance.
Tell the story.
The story is rather wonderful. Here he was. We actually had to write the descant for him. He couldn't actually improvise, as would have been the case in the 16th century. But nevertheless, extraordinary. Just standing up in front of television cameras and doing it. In the interval, he was doing his Greek prep.
Very nicely, another boy from the north. And his father was a porter at one of the Cambridge colleges, and you see that meritocratic idea. At the court, you get quite a lot of all of these foundations that we know about, Eton, later Harrow under Elizabeth I. They're small colleges of fellows, and then the poor boys who are educated alongside them that form the choir. And we must get this right, that these are not, especially in the cathedrals, and especially in the larger collegiate churches, they're not the main choir, they're the Lady Chapel choir. So all our modern choral foundations descend from pretty much Lady Chapel choirs, and it's quite interesting that, because that is where the more complex music is performed. At the Marian liturgies, the Marian feasts, that's where in England the polyphonic music is performed. For the mainstay, it's still chant. And the use of
and the amateur monks, the amateur monks, yeah.
So for the mainstay, there's still quite a lot of chant, and there is quite a bit of the population. Someone like Lawrence can talk to you about this, Lawrence Hemming, that there is a huge amount of literacy amongst the laity, because there is this regular tradition and the repetition, the cyclical nature of the church's year, and hymns and the responsories, these things, people do know them. You know, go and talk to your Eamon Duffys and all the others, and they'll be able to conclusively prove this wasn't just the sort of thing that later people describe as Latin mumming. This is very much something that they did understand and have a literacy awareness of. So, just getting to Elizabeth, her chapel royal is key to what we inherit today, because by this accident of history, by the fact that she was her father's daughter, an incredibly accomplished virginal player. The virginal was this very delicate chamber music instrument. And just to finish what David was saying about this division between the outdoor musicians, those who could ride into battle on a horse, blowing trumpets and shawms and sackbuts, making a loud noise, you don't invite those sort of rough people into the house normally, do you? They stay outside.
And the noise is intolerable.
The noise is pretty...
We tested it at Crosby Hall. It's intolerable. Yeah. A shawm letting go. I mean...
It is very, very loud. But remember their worldview, their bodies, their humours, the music that is good for your digestion is the lute, the softer instruments, the music of the chamber, and they would literally have music sung to them in that beautiful Dowland-esque way, the beginnings of that real age of melancholy, that allowed you to drift off and to calm you down before your sleep. So what David and I are really keen on is describing this specificity of time and place and the music that accompanied it. Music announced the time of day. Music announced. We were talking about the king goeth forth in procession. Even in Elizabeth's reign, you would hear what was going on.
And the court wait again. That literally the time of day is sounded. One of the reasons they're incredible, interesting clocks as they're developing, because again the court day is tightly structured. You've got to get larger numbers of people doing the same thing. I mean, we've seen the problems of getting a group like you actually turning up on time. And you can imagine when you're dealing with a court of several hundred, with highly formal ritualized structures and whatever, people have to be on time.
I think we want now for you to have your opportunity. So I think
is that all right? Is this a good? I mean, we know we could listen all day, but I think let's. So I am going to go first. Sorry. So I just want to take us in a slightly different direction and to open up what I know is a huge subject. So I'm just hoping, David, you might respond briefly so that other people can.
Is that a hint?
Amidst these illogical but always thought through before the decision comes on Henry's part. I mean, something which happens, I think we would, perhaps you may disagree, but in short order and pretty radically and thoroughly, the dissolution of the monasteries. And I think understudied, but we just had James Clark's book. Now, I want to link this. My particular question is around the supremacy and the first of your three things that Henry convinces himself of. My understanding is that with a few exceptions, we know the martyrs, most of the heads of religious houses actually submit to the key things, to the supremacy. Reading, my understanding is that the Abbot of Reading is in Parliament in 1535-6, having, if not cheerfully, then having signed up to the supremacy and so on and so forth. 3 years later, it's all over and he's dead. So supremacy, achieving that, doesn't seem to save you if you're a religious house, even if you've ticked Henry's number 1 box. So I just wondered if you could reflect for a moment about the dissolution and how you see that fitting into Henry's mental processes.
The thing to understand, again, is foreign policy. I'm going to surprise you all. Remember, Henry pays the only reason that Henry can get away with defying Catherine's nephew, with defying the Emperor Charles V, who's not interested in Catherine as a human being or as his aunt, but as a symbol of family honour. You've got again to understand this. Charles V shows his nature of his family feeling by imprisoning his own mother and forcing her into a kind of quasi-madness so that he can rule. He accepts arranged marriage without a thought and has a different woman every day for whom he pays a ducat. That's the world of the Holy Roman Emperor. Henry then is able to defy Charles and this sense of family honour only because of the support of Francis of France. And what does France get for it? I was explaining to you yesterday that the House of Tudor makes this gigantic investment in the Habsburgs. When Francis is captured in 1525 and imprisoned by the emperor and released, what happens is that Francis is forced to assume this vast imperial debt to England. Wolsey comes back from the treaties of Amiens in 1527 and says to Henry, you will never need to call another parliament. That there is a tidal wave of French gold. Then Henry says, 1532 at Boulogne, well, I do actually want to marry this woman. Francis says, fine, we've a deal. I'll support you, pension goes. So Henry faces, at the beginning of the 1530s, what had become the principal stay. And remember, it's important to realise this. You get, in the spring, the 2 quarter days, March and the beginning of October, the end of September at Michaelmas, Lady Day and Michaelmas, you get bags of beautiful new French gold coins. You don't have to meet a parliament, you don't have to squeeze people, you don't have to fiddle law, it's all just delivered and then it stops. And I think to understand the famous scene of Cromwell saying, I will make you the richest king, you have to understand the rise of Cromwell, the man who is going to complete the dissolution of the monasteries. You've got to understand that in that context. Also, of course, he's trained in the dissolution of monasteries for Wolsey's colleges, which he actually leads and perfects and becomes very unpopular because of doing. So he's acquired expertise in this. And then, very, very strikingly, Cromwell's first role at court is the management of the private royal finances that depend on the income from France. That's what he's doing. And so there is a huge deficit. And I think that what he does, the way the dissolution works, remember, is you present it as exactly as Wolsey's dissolutions, exactly as Henry VII's, all Richard Fox, all of those ecclesiastical foundations at Oxford and Cambridge are based on dissolved monasteries, priories, nunneries, hospitals, whatever. And you present the early stages of the dissolution exactly like that these are sad and defective houses. There's then a profound debate between Cromwell and Anne Boleyn. It is perfectly clear that Anne Boleyn, I think essentially managed by Matthew Parker, who is the head of the College of Stoke by Clare and the one who is going to become the first Archbishop to Elizabeth, Matthew Parker and Anne Boleyn want to adapt the monastic and particularly collegiate we need to talk about colleges as well, collegiate foundations. They want to adapt those to teaching and learning. And if they'd had their way, the history of England would be completely different. It would, higher learning would not just focus on Oxford and Cambridge. Cromwell is absolutely determined on financial grounds they have to be dissolved completely and the money come to the crown. And then, of course, that then, first of all, the fall of Anne Boleyn, 1536, and then the dissolution itself, which triggers the Pilgrimage of Grace. And it's the Pilgrimage of Grace which I think turns what I think would have been a relatively small and piecemeal operation into this business of the king sensing rebellion, that the monasteries are seen now as hotbeds of papal power and resistance, and the larger process gets underway. But I don't think there's ever a moment before 1540 when Henry thinks we've got to get rid of all of the monasteries. I think Cromwell did, but I don't believe Henry did. You see, it's also how you get away with things. It's the very piecemealness of it is how you get away with it, because you don't tread on everybody's toes at once. And the other thing that's really important to understand is that Henry respects property right absolutely. All of these things are done with the most minute respect for law. Every monastic debt is honoured. The monks are paid, if they accept it, they're paid very substantial pensions. And abbots, of course, very often finish up as deans of cathedrals or whatever foundation and whatever they're promoted into the church. And by indeed the time you've got to the reign of Mary, the entire fruit of augmentations is taken up with pensions. So there's this extraordinary legalism. Everything is done by act of Parliament. You will hear somebody the king orders somebody to be executed. The king could not order somebody to be executed. I mean, the obvious sensible thing to do was to murder Catherine of Aragon. Undoubtedly, that's what would have happened in any European country. You can't do it. You don't do it in England. We don't kill people privately. You kill them publicly and horribly. But that's the proper English way of doing it.
Thank you. So it's the cash first. Okay, everyone else's turn. There must be some questions or comments. Philip.
Just wondering about, you spoke about the ritual of the chapel royal from Henry through to Elizabeth. And what was the awareness of the general population of what was going on in the chapel royal?
Remember, the routines that I'm talking about, the Epiphany, the Maundy and whatever, these were all replicated in the houses of great noblemen. The royal household is just the greatest of the English great households. So these are pretty universal practices. And the king's household is the kind of biggest edition of that. And the reason we see it as being peculiar is all these practices die in the noble houses. And of course, as so many of the nobles do when they get on the wrong side of the king. So I think there's, and again, it's because the royal year is the standard church year. And again, everybody who matters goes to court. This is the other thing that one has to understand about England, that the courtiers that I'm talking about, the Nicholas Carews, the Francis Bryans, and all the rest of them, they're great figures in the localities. Every MP is a figure in his community. There's much more frequent move to London. The king does not go. I mean, the great shift of the English monarchy takes place under Henry VIII when it really becomes a kind of Tory government. It settles down firmly in the Thames Valley. And the more so as you get further and further into the reign of Henry VIII, because his physical mobility declines, so he gets from palace to palace essentially by boat. So and again, you no longer ride through the landscape. The principal royal activity is hunting. You spend half your life hunting. Louis XIV, Louis XVI, on the day that the Bastille falls, writes rien in his diary, which means he hadn't hunted. And Henry is the same, but what you have to do towards the end is he doesn't ride in search of the deer, you bring the deer to him, which is why you have the gigantic royal parks in London. They're all the parks for the Palace of Whitehall, and the king would be got up onto a horse, the horse would ride into a little mound, and you would then drive the deer in front of him so that he could sit there with a gun or a crossbow wound up by somebody else and pop them off as the poor creatures go in front of him. But so it's a monarchy that very much settles down, but people come to court. They come to Parliament. And remember, the centre of Henry's reign is this unique Parliament, the Reformation Parliament that lasts for 7 years. It's this extraordinary relationship of locality and centre. People are very much more familiar with politics than we think. And there's people. Everybody has got the court agents. There are newsletters going out. It's extraordinary how, again, accidental survivals of correspondence at the beginning of Henry's reign. You will find, in Northumberland, they're gossiping. about which nobleman's in, which nobleman's out. Has the Earl of Northumberland really? Oh, wait, you've heard this. He's gone into an alliance with the Duke of. This is somewhere I don't know what. Somewhere I can't pronounce, and if it was in Geordie, I wouldn't understand. But they're talking about it, and again, all the work that Geoffrey Elton did in policy and police, the staggering awareness. The awareness of the religious changes, and the point that Daniel was making about this being a much more literate society than we think. Thomas More estimates that at least a third of the English male population is literate. The levels are much higher. And again, of course, with the book, with printing, the habit of reading. Extraordinary. The Duke of Norfolk, when he's arrested at the end of the reign and is put in the Tower where he doesn't think he will come out of, do you know what he asks? He says, I must have a book. I can't go to sleep unless I read before bedtime. The utter modernity.
Let's take a couple, and then David and Sarah. Peter and David, and then Chris.
I was wondering if you might say something about the quality of those late medieval bishops in the English Church. And one thing that's been endlessly discussed at the minute is the sort of lamentable theological literacy of the House of Bishops. At the minute, it's almost as if we have the most theologically untrained House of Bishops that we've had in
with an exception.
I remember in a tutorial once, Dermot Cutler said to me, what you've got to remember is that these English bishops, by contrast with their continental counterparts, were significantly more literate, more educated. On the continent, you had the sort of dim sums, the aristocracy, elevated.
The English pattern is completely different. The only sees, in fact this applies to none under Henry, the only sees where there is a tradition of appointing leading members of the aristocracy in the north. That you get Percys and Nevilles to Carlisle and particularly to Durham. But generally speaking, the English bishops are of supreme quality. They're the brightest boys of their period. They're invariably Oxbridge graduates. They've usually got experience in Italy, but they are not theologians. They are canon lawyers. They're experts in canon law, including Warren. The rarity is the theologian bishop like Fisher. And there's a particular see for them, which is the least valuable, Rochester. They're normally appointed to Rochester. On the other hand, I think the calibre of Henry's bishops is spectacularly high. His father, again, as part of that package of 1504, when he appoints Fisher to Rochester, he writes a letter to Lady Margaret and says, I'm actually ashamed of many of my appointments of bishops. I haven't, effectively, been bribed. He does deals. I mean, Henry VII strips the church almost as much as his son, but in a different, he leaves it alive. Whereas Henry in some ways nearly strangles it. But the calibre gets better and better under Henry. I mean, figures like Tunstall, they are the absolute cutting edge of scholarship. And Tunstall has got better Greek, much better Greek than Erasmus. And again, it's Erasmus who talks about the court of Henry as being more distinguished than any university.
It's important as well, isn't it, to understand the English bishoprics as being, compared to, say, the Italian ones, much larger.
Yeah, they're very rich. They're also hugely rich.
Ducal incomes, essentially.
Particularly Winchester. Winchester creates the University of Oxford. If you look at the number of colleges that derive from the bishops of Winchester, and again, it's to see that Wolsey gets his hands on, Wolsey holds sees in Commendam, along with St Albans, which is the richest of the monasteries, and so on. But the colour, Wolsey is very unusual in not having a doctorate. They almost all they have the double doctorate in canon and civil law. They're spectacular quality.
What is the book that discusses the incomes of the bishops? Is it by Elizabeth?
The Valor Ecclesiasticus,
Yeah.
Which is the universe. Well, it's the basis of the dissolution of all the dissolutions. I mean, again, it's the ecclesiastical equivalent of Doomsday, and done with astonishing speed. I mean, you have no bureaucracy. And yet you have, again, the English political elite, the great shift that happens in the reign of Henry VIII. Well, there's so many, but it's the process of laicization. What you have to remember, up to the beginning of, up to 1529, virtually the whole of the central government secretariat is clerical in your sense of the word. And then, in the course of the 1530s, there's this extraordinary laicization, which again produces a different political elite in England. The unique fact, it also happens, I think, is true in Eastern Europe, in Poland and whatever, but you have an aristocracy that goes to university. The extraordinary change in the composition of Oxford and Cambridge. Oxford and Cambridge are almost entirely clerical until the 1530s, and then you get a remarkable shift to the laity, and this of course means that you have a Latinate laity. They are the grammar schools and Oxbridge mean that you have a various people like William Cecil and whatever are the first generation of these people. Again, it's important to understand the radical laicization of Parliament. That the key act of Parliament that really summarises the consequences of the royal supremacy is, of all things, it's called the Act of Precedence of 1539, and you saw it in operation actually at the King's accession. The way people are arranged is still governed by the Act of Precedence, which is why all the prime ministers were standing down there looking up at these important people, like Lord Presidents of the Council and whatever. But up again, it's really important we understand this. Up to 1539. The king is not alone on the dais in the House of Lords. He has the Archbishop of Canterbury on his left, on his right, and he has the Archbishop of York on his left. The entire left-hand benches are ecclesiastical, with the bishops in their scarlet parliamentary robes on the front benches and the mitred abbots in their black on the back benches, and even the beginning of the lay bench on the right-hand side, the dukes sit halfway down because the bishops of the Diocese of York sit at the top. And what happens with what happens with the Act of Precedence of 1539 is you rearrange Parliament so the king is unique in the centre with the bishops on his right hand and the lay peers on his left hand. So you have that sense, which you see also in the title page of the Great Bible, as the monarch unique with the two, if you like, the church and people arrayed on either hand beneath him, but a literate laity.
In the line of King Henry, to what extent was the dissolution of the monasteries attached to the Reformation itself? Was it a completion of the Reformation? And how as he goes through the 1540s, especially with his last wife, how did he envisage the future? Because in 1547, surely it all changed, and the direction of the church changed quite dramatically. So how did he make those connections?
As I said, I don't think Henry saw it as a logical process at all. And I don't think the English Reformation merely begins under Henry. There's no sense in which the country is Protestant in 1547. In fact, what I would argue is that the confessional Reformation only begins with Henry's death. It is only once this extraordinary figure is out of the way that you actually get a confessional Reformation and counter-Reformation. Because it's at that point in which you clearly ally with continental movements like Lutheranism, like Zwinglianism, like Calvinism, and whatever, and the notion of a reformed church comes into the English mind, which, remember, is never complete. That's why there are Puritans. The English Reformation is only completed, if you like, by Oliver Cromwell. And then it destroys itself. But it's really important we understand this. But equally, and I think it is, again, crucially important that historians have tended to write these things assuming that, as it were, popular opinion shifts. It doesn't. Every new reign in English history, from Henry VIII, and it then stops with 1689, every new reign is a religious change. There is a single monarch who keeps things as they were to begin with, and bizarrely, it's James I. Astonishingly, because of course he knew what Calvinism really meant. I mean, if you remember that image, and again, it's so useful to think of these things in material, physical terms. When he's in, you can imagine the excitement of this insignificant little man suddenly sitting in the chapel in that great royal pew at Hampton Court, looking down on his clergy. When he's back home in Edinburgh, he's down there, and they're up there in the pulpit saying, "You silly man. You try saying that into an English king." It is the supremacy. The Laudianism is simply the end of James, with an argument. Arguably, it's essentially about foreign policy. Again, peace, particularly peace with Spain, and then the personal taste of Charles I. One just has to understand this. That's what changes things, because that is where the power is. Unfortunately, of course, you have to mediate that power if you want to do anything really radical. You have to mediate it through Parliament. And that's the point at which it becomes very, very difficult to control. Elizabeth, as it were, middle ground, via media, whatever you want to call it, is really just the Chapel Royal and Westminster. It hardly extends outside that, maybe the odd Oxbridge College. Whereas increasingly radical processes of reform happen on completely piecemeal.
Is this
county by county.
Your view, then, when you're educated with Elton, that the idea of this burgeoning bureaucracy and the notion that personalities become less important? And you had that famous argument with your tutor where you said, what was it you said about...
what I'm trying to say is the central issue before 1689, England is one of the most outstanding examples of cuius regio eius religio. Quite simply. And then, of course, in 1689, it stands on its head, and the king has to have the religion of his people, which is, why you introduce the role, why you eliminate Catholics from the succession. But what I said to I'm afraid, Geoffrey Ulton, who argued a kind of neo-Weberian approach that the medieval kingship is essentially charismatic and informal and household-based, and in the early 16th century one sees a move to bureaucracy and depersonalized government and institutions. I said to him, Geoffrey, would you explain to me, because I'm rather simple-minded about these things, the moment at which Thomas Cromwell explained to Henry VIII that he was redundant. A horrible silence fell, and I'm afraid I concluded by suggesting it was probably the day before his execution. But one has to understand this, that the driving forces is the monarch.
Let's take it to I think we had Christopher Smith and then James and
I wonder whether this is all one of terrible ignorance I realise I have on the period, but I wonder whether I could get you to say a bit more about your take on Erasmus. Because
I'm finding it very hard. The acoustic in this direction is terrible, yeah. Do you mind? I'm sorry. Elderly hearing.
I wonder whether I could get you to say a bit more about Erasmus.
Yeah.
Until I met you, I was rather inclined to conceive of Erasmus as sort of potentially part of the solution for reconcile and all of that. But the picture you've painted really is Erasmus part of the problem. And I just wonder whether you could just say a little bit more about him and your view of him.
What I've been trying to do is to be brutally realistic on the subject of Erasmus. Erasmus is very tempting because he's one of us. he would have been a natural don. He is a natural don. He's the kind of person who comes to Rome and would have mingled effortlessly in this company, wonderfully good gossip, written marvellous letters afterwards and whatever. And he's just like us, totally unused to power and naive and whatever, when it comes to these things. And what we've tended to do is to assume that people actually listened to the content of what Erasmus said. And I think they only do so when it suits another purpose. So the notion that this is what's purveyed by James McConaughey. There's a bit of it in the book on Erasmianism. There's something of it in Lord Dacre, in Hugh Trevor Roper. This idea that Erasmus represents a sweet voice of reason. Well, he may do, but nobody really listens to it. In other words, when Erasmus writes the Querela Pacis in 1516, why is he patronized for doing it? Because Charles V has now succeeded in the Netherlands. He's actually made good. He's declared of age. It's happened without any French intervention, and there's a court party around him that wants, very unusually for the Habsburgs, peace with France. So, of course, the Querela Pacis is absolutely wonderful. And Erasmus, suddenly gets this rush of blood to the head and writes about universal peace and all the rest of it. At which point, also, the English have actually played out the exchequer, so they can no longer afford to keep up the tournée which they seized, which was a great fruit of Henry's first war against France in 1513, and Wolsey knows it's going to have to be surrendered back to the French. But I mean, how shameful is that? So what Wolsey does is dress this up as a treaty of universal peace, with lots and lots of Erasmian echoes in the it's called the Treaty of Universal and Perpetual Peace. It lasts 6 months. But it's just that everybody at that moment, it was convenient for them to do it. And Erasmus provides this wonderful fancy dress language that you can use. Similarly, when Cranmer, for reasons that Erasmus abominated, wants to do what he wants to do, start serious withdrawal from Catholicism, Erasmus, in the biblical commentary of 1516 on 1 Corinthians 14, provides him exactly with the material that he wants. So you see what I mean? What you must see Erasmus, that vast, you all know the Toronto edition, about 40 volumes. I mean, his productivity is, of course, he's the first intellectual superstar. He invents the kind of nowadays he would have been a leading teledon. And he profound awareness of image. It's why we have more portraits of Erasmus than anybody who's not a royal. This extraordinary self-consciousness. But you have to see him essentially as a quarry, not again as a complete package. And the problem has been that people have seen it as a package and assumed that people bought into it as a package. Most importantly of all, it just provides the language. So you write for Reformation and Counter-Reformation and Zwinglianism and Calvinism in Erasmian prose and using Erasmian tropes because it's fashionable. But you don't get your content from him.
Okay, so we do James, David, and then David, Rocco, and Stephen.
Yes, because my question, can you hear me?
I'll tell you this.
My question is about legacy for Henry VIII, and specifically Edward VI, because one curiosity for me is that, as you spoke all about length yesterday, Henry is obsessed with his conviction about royal supremacy over essentially a Catholic Church, but without papacy, but with, say, Catholic practice and devotion. And we know he's very interested in an heir. Obviously, that's incredibly important to him, who is heir, having a male heir. So, of course, the importance of Edward VI cannot be overstated before Henry VIII. And yet, towards the end, and despite his interest in an heir, despite his interest in a legacy, he produces an heir who ends up being very different from him in terms of religious outlook. And I know there's a controversy about how much power just slipped away from Henry in the final with the Council of Protectors around Edward VI and so on, whether Henry was hoodwinked, whether he was aware that this was happening and just let go to create effectively a fully Protestant.
You're right. Okay.
What's your take on Henry's attitude to his legacy in Edward VI in terms of the massive shift of religious?
What I think is important to realise, I mean, you put your finger on several things on that. You're absolutely right about the centrality of the birth of Edward. Henry sees Edward's birth as God rewarding him for doing the right thing. I don't think Henry had harboured any doubts, but Edward's birth, remember, so far into his reign, Edward's birth is the signifier of divine favour. There is no doubt about that. You get two very closely related pictures. I was talking about text. Painting and text, again, is an absolutely central thing. You get the two key images of Henry's reign, or two of the key images. One is the Whitehall mural that shows Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, and then Henry VIII and the already dead Jane Seymour, with the verses in the centre in which Henry says, "My father was great because he suppressed civil war. I am greater. I am greatest." You know, this is Frank Sinatra in Latin. I am greatest because whilst I wielded the sceptre, the power of popes was trodden underfoot, and true religion was restored in England. That's 1537, the year of Edward's birth and all the rest of it. And then there's the portrait, the wonderful Holbein portrait of the baby Edward, the royal baby Edward, with actually, again, the verses, in this time, in the name of, signed by Richard Morrison. I think Morrison had also written the verses, though they're not signed, the Privy Chamber mural, in which the little boy Edward is told to emulate his great father. And if he emulates his great father, he'll be great too. This is what you've touched on is there are two elements to the debate. The first is the choice of Edward's tutors, people like Cox and whatever. And it's very difficult. There is no direct evidence as to whether they were chosen and because they were of Reformed tendency, or whether they were chosen simply because they were the most distinguished Latinists of the day. And they're both. So there's that. The business of the future in Henry, there is no doubt that Henry thought he had controlled that future with his will. And I've written about this extensively. The will is designed deliberately, it's modelled on his father's will, and it's deliberately designed to exclude a protectorate. But what it has is a very interesting clause in it, which says no one member of the council must act on behalf of the whole council unless they all agree. And that is used as if that was there clearly as a device to stop a protectorate. It's used as a device to create a protectorate. And the will is also never signed, it's stamped. And it can be demonstrated that it is the date on which it is allegedly signed is not the date on which the stamp is actually applied to it, and that its contents reflect a change in the composition of the council that happens days before Henry's death, whereas the will is nominally dated to the 30th of December. I think what happens is, and I've again written about this quite extensively, that there is an overt conspiracy surrounding the king, which is stage managed by as it were, the political wing of Protestantism. That's to say, by William Paget, who is the royal secretary and manages the whole process of the inner royal, the Privy Council, the inner administration, and obviously Edward Seymour, but also this leading servants of the King's Privy Chamber. This is the equivalent of the Downing Street staff. It's Edward Denny and William Harbert. And Denny controls, not the Secretary of State, the man who controls the stamp of Henry's signature is the head of the Privy Chamber. And he is part of this extreme confessional group around the king. As I said, the King's Council is split pretty well evenly. Because remember, nobody actually believes in what Henry believes in. No, it's really, I'm being deadly serious, that nobody, apart from, I think, from Elizabeth, nobody believes in the so-called Henrician via media. You're either, and this is why, of course, the politics of the end of Henry's reign are so terrible. You step out of line a little bit towards what you really believe in, which is Catholicism, you're guilty of treason, and you're chopped in four, having your privates cut off first to make sure you feel it. If you vary a little bit towards Luther or Zwingli, you're burned. And that terrible politics is also that politics of balance. But inevitably, once Henry is removed, it becomes confessional, because it's only the king's idiosyncrasy that keeps this weird, all the attempts at giving intellectual substance to what Henry does are meaningless. Henry is not Catholicism without the Pope. Henry does not believe in priesthood. Henry believes in a single order of ordination, which is kings. There's no ordination of bishops in the Bible, no ordination of Christian priests. There's an extensive description of unction being applied to Solomon and whatever. He's a biblical literalist in that sense, but it's really striking. And he sees, again, if you look at the other great images, which are absolutely central to comprehending Henry, the Great Bible, what the Great Bible shows is, again, the country divided into laity and into the church, but Henry as the sole mediator between God and man, not his bishops. And remember, Henry's title, do we all know what the formal title of the supremacy is? Supreme head on earth of the churches of England and Ireland, only under Christ. That's the title. And if you look at the title page of the Great Bible, God, of course, does appear on it, and there's all this verbum Dei stuff, but you've never seen such a polite little God, tiny little God at the top, with Henry obviously kneeling to him, and because he's a gentleman, he's taken his crown off. But clearly, God is really rather impressed to meet Henry, and I think the two of them converse essentially on a level. No, they're kings. He sees God as another king, and the Bible is given only to Henry. God hands the Bible to Henry. Henry then, enthroned and crowned, sits on a neo-papal throne, 5 steps and all the rest of it, lions and whatever. And he gives the Bible with his right hand to Cranmer and with his left hand to Cromwell, who is then hastily scrubbed out in the new edition because, of course, he's been executed. But that's it. There is that vision.
David, I'm going to ask you to either answer the question later, perhaps time, or to find David and ask him. I think with the ambition of Henry as the sole mediator, it's a good time to pause. I'm not going to try and, there is so much, of course, as we all sit here thinking through, I'm sure, reflections on all we've heard in the light of our priesthood, dare I say it, and of the Catholic faith of the Church of England today, and that perhaps gives us a look forward to the third and final part later on. But in the meantime, at the moment, we're going to go to chapel for a massive bit of music, which doesn't make us like a doltish, but rather we will have that inspiration to virtue as a result of the music that we're enjoying. So with some mass at midday, but in the meantime, after so much more riches, I'm sure we want to show our appreciation